Alrighty, we are thrilled to welcome back another third-time guest to the Fullback Dive in Jeanna Thomas, the Atlanta Falcons insider for the Falcoholic of SBNation. Jeanna, how's everything been?
Everything's been great. Thanks. How are you?
All is well. Appreciate you coming on again. We always love chatting the Falcons with you. You've given our fantasy football users some great insight in the past, and we're hoping to strike gold again in 2019. So thrilled to have you.
Thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Speaking of the Falcons, obviously this offense is just brimming with talent, and even amidst Steve Sarkisian's kind of sketchy play calling, they still ranked sixth in total yards last year, 10th in points. So they still had, by all kind of measures, a solid season. Yet, considering everything they have, it seemed like a little bit underwhelming, in my opinion, for what they're capable of. And considering all that, they can Sarkisian despite those decent stats. They bring in Dirk Koetter, obviously a familiar face, his second stint there. What can you tell us about Dirk Koetter? What is he bringing to the table? Can you break down his scheme a little bit? What can we expect from him round two with the Falcons?
Yeah, they keep saying that they're going to retain most of the elements of the Kyle Shanahan, Steve Sarkisian offense. I don't think that they're going to. I think if you look at their offseason moves, especially the way that they've shored up the offensive line, I think that they really want to shift their focus more to getting some kind of a run game going. They've got an interesting stable of running backs. But I think that the main thing that Koetter brings to the table is just familiarity with these players, especially Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan had some of his best seasons under Koetter. There's a high comfort level there. They've got Julio Jones in the fold, obviously. Calvin Ridley, who had an impressive rookie season. Mohamed Sanu, who can be a dangerous weapon. And then, looking at the running backs, getting Devonta Freeman back, presumably healthy. They've still got Ito Smith, and then they brought in Kadri Ellison this year, so they've got some interesting guys there. And Austin Hooper has really quietly taken steps forward every year, so I think that Koetter has a ton of talent to work with. I'm really excited to see what he does. But, yeah, I think that we'll see them shift a little bit more to an emphasis on the run. Obviously, they're going to spread the ball around a lot because they've got too much talent not to. But, yeah, I think that this should be a really high-performing offense this year.
Absolutely. And in his stints with the Bucs, at least, especially last year, they almost led. I think it was number 2 in deep passing yards. Koetter loved to attack teams as like the 4 verticals and spread teams out wide. Do you think even with an emphasis on the run, we're going to still see that kind of vertical style offense, or what are you picturing?
I think that if you've got guys like Julio Jones, who's just got this insane power or combination of power and speed, and Calvin Ridley, who is such a beautiful route runner. I think that if you're not throwing that deep ball, I don't know what you're doing. I think you probably don't have any business in the NFL. So, yes, I think that unless Dirk Koetter has lost his mind, that he will be doing that.
Absolutely, yeah. They led the league in passing yards last year, the Bucs did, so maybe the Falcons can do something similar, and the man behind all that would be Matt Ryan, the QB2 in fantasy last year. He's familiar in the system, as you just alluded to with Koetter. He's got an insane weapons cabinet, and you mentioned the beefed up offensive line. So I love everything about Ryan, who had a great year last year by all accounts, but he's still falling as like the QB7 in fantasy right now in drafts. Am I missing something, or what are you expecting for Ryan here?
We even have Falcons fans who tweet at us every day and say that Matt Ryan is a bum and should be cut. So I think that he just doesn't have the same reputation as a guy like, Brady or Drew Brees or Aaron Rodgers. And I think it's probably the lack of a Super Bowl ring. Now, if you look to Atlanta's failure to win Super Bowl 51, it really wasn't on Ryan. He had an exceptional game, and it wasn't his fault. But I think that he bears a large amount of that blame. And frankly, if people keep sleeping on him, that's fine, because I was able to draft him very late last year, and it helped me win a lot of games. So he can stay at number 7. Maybe I'll be able to snag him in some leagues.
Absolutely, I'm with you. Yeah, I hope he continues to fall down because it's one of the better bargains. It's a high floor. We know he's performed with Koetter before, and he's performed well these last 4 or 5 years. And the ceiling, I think, is going underrated. And a lot of the reason he has such a big ceiling, you mentioned Julio Jones, just an absolute freak and one of the most dominant receivers in the game right now. And last year, he was scoreless through week 9, I believe it was. It's just crazy to me with a talent like Julio. How does he not score? He's doing everything else but scoring. And then he goes and scores 8 touchdowns in 7 games to end the season. So Could we see a more consistent Jones under Koetter? Could he help him pick up where he left off, or should we be concerned he's going to go back to that kind of allergic end zone status?
I actually think that we will see a more consistent Julio with Koetter. Koetter did a really nice job of using him before when he was with the Falcons. So I think that things will even out for him. I also think that with Ridley having a full year under his belt, I think that and the way that he played last year, I think that he's going to pull some coverage away from Julio, which will make it easier for him in the red zone and actually all over the field. So I think that will help.
Yeah, speaking of Ridley, it's a nice segue. Do you expect him to take another step forward as a sophomore? We kind of had those monster, like 146 yards, 3 TDs one week, and then just wasn't really heard from in other weeks. Can he find some consistency? What do you think about his sophomore campaign?
Yeah, I mean, it really could go one of two ways. Either we see him take a step forward, and I think that that's a real possibility because one of the complaints about Steve Sarkisian was just his inconsistency. He would dial up some plays that I think were just meant to be creative, but they were actually dumb. Yeah. So I think that definitely held Ridley back in some games and other players as well. But I also think we could see him have a sophomore slump. It's not unusual for players in their second year. It'll be interesting to me if getting new coaches in on that side of the ball, particularly Koetter, if that will help him avoid a sophomore slump. Because sometimes when you get a different voice in that receivers room, it does make a big difference, a positive difference. So I'm hoping that it's that and not a sophomore slump.
What do you think would be the right way for Koetter to use this guy to have him kind of reach his ceiling? What does he do best?
What he does best is run beautiful routes. I mean, he runs the cleanest routes that I've ever seen, especially from such a young player. You know, there's a big learning curve with this position from college to the NFL. There's less of a learning curve for receivers out of Alabama, but there's still a learning curve. And so I think that he can use him effectively by taking advantage of weaknesses on defense and using Calvin Ridley's route running against them. So that's what I'm hoping to see from him with Ridley.
Absolutely. And switching over to kind of the run game now, you mentioned early on you expect a greater emphasis on the run. Koetter does have actually a pretty extensive run track record when he was with the Jaguars as their OC way back in the day, but Maurice Jones-Drew had some monster seasons, and we've got Devonta Freeman here, who, yes, he had an injury-ridden 2018 and underwhelming 2017, but he used to be a fantasy first-rounder. Tevin Coleman's now gone. Is there any chance he can kind of get back to that 1,500 total yard, 13 TD style guy, top 5 guy, or what do you expect from Freeman now?
I hope so.
Yeah.
And I will say one of the issues with Freeman here recently has mainly been the injuries. I mean, he was on injured reserve for the bulk of last year, and obviously that's going to cut into your productivity. But yeah, I think that with him healthy, and I think the biggest issue is last season, both of Atlanta's starting guards went on IR. And so they've replaced both guard positions now, including investing the number 14 overall pick into Chris Lindstrom out of Boston College. And so I think that demonstrates has been so bad for the past couple of seasons. So I think that those changes along the line should give a boost to the run game. So can Devonta get back to those astronomical numbers? I don't know. I hope so. But I do think that he should be right around 1,000 yards this season at least. I think that he's going to get a lot of work as long as he stays healthy. And we did see some good things from Ito Smith last year. I know his yards per carry were not great, but we saw some flashes of what he's capable of. And then Ollison is more of a traditional power back, which, Koetter has had success with in the past. So it'll be interesting to see if they work him into the game plan at all, just kind of to change the pace a little bit.
Absolutely. You hit upon the fact that Freeman has a pretty sketchy recent injury history. And so in fantasy, getting the right handcuff, as they're called, can be huge for fantasy owners, especially when it's a gig as valuable as this offense with this, what's looking like one of the better offensive lines in the league here. If he goes down, how do you envision this backfield getting handled?
I think Ito Smith would take over most of the reps. And then, I think that they would use Ollison as the secondary guy. They've also got Brian Hill on the roster. He's a guy that they drafted in the 5th round a couple of years ago. Never really caught on, landed on practice squad. I think he got signed away by the Bengals and then landed back here. So he is a third option in case Devonta would go down, heaven forbid. But they've got some other talent back there. They don't have anybody that's on par with Tevin Coleman. So that's, we're kind of sorry to see Tevin go with Devontae's injury history, but it wasn't practical to keep him. So I get it.
Absolutely. And the last kind of known offensive piece I want to touch upon is Austin Hooper. He was the tight end 6th last year, career highs across the board. I'm expecting a big 2019. Koetter has a very nice track record targeting his tight ends, whether it was Cameron Brate, whether it's O.J. Howard, even Mercedes Lewis with the Jaguars had an 11 touchdown season. So I love the history, but what do you think of Hooper? Is there any chance he takes another step forward?
I think Hooper will continue to take steps forward. One of the things that I really am impressed with in terms of Hooper is that he makes time in the offseason to work one-on-one with Matt Ryan so they can work on their timing and their chemistry. And I like that for Matt and for Hooper. I think that it's helped Hooper grow as a player by leaps and bounds, and I think that it can only lead to improvement again this year. That comfort level is huge, and so the fact that Ryan has that with Hooper, I think is enough of an endorsement that we should expect him to take another step forward this year.
Absolutely. And the last question, a couple years ago, you turned us on to Taylor Gabriel. He had that breakout season, I think it was 2016 or so. Is there anybody we're not talking about right now? Anyone on the Falcons roster that should be getting a little more attention and isn't?
I got to say, I was as a prospect in 2017, I guess. No, 2018. He was the 2018 draft. And he's just really versatile. He's similar to Devontae in that he is effective as a receiver out of the backfield or as a running back. He's got decent vision. He's shifty enough. And so especially if, heaven forbid, Devontae does go down with an injury, I think that Ito Smith could surprise some people. So he is one that I would recommend keeping an eye on, especially throughout preseason. And, he might be a handcuff to consider just if you do draft Devontae. Absolutely.
And last overall question, not so much fantasy related, but what are your expectations for the Falcons? That division is real tough, but they still, like we just talked about, so many talented players on offense. They have some defensive talent as well. Dan Quinn, they've got familiarity with their coach. What are you thinking for them in 2019 here?
I think that last year would have been different if they hadn't been decimated by injuries. And I know the injuries are part of the game, but if you lose both starting guards, your starting running back, both starting safeties, and your middle linebacker, who's essentially the quarterback of the defense, all early in the season, it's not going to go well for you. So getting all those guys back, having Dan Quinn take over the defensive coordinator role, having somebody on the sideline to help Dan Quinn with in-game management decisions, I think that this team should win 10 games just on the merit of the talent that it has. It is a very tough schedule, but Drew Brees is getting older. We saw his pass velocity and distance trail off toward the end of last year. I am a Saints hater, so I know that might be wishful thinking, but I'm hoping that the Saints aren't as good as everybody expects. Carolina's kind of an unknown, but they always play the Falcons tough. And, Tampa Bay should be a much better team, I think, with Bruce Arians. I'm really interested to see what they look like. And the NFC in general is just not going to be easy. So I think the Falcons will win 9 or 10 games. And frankly, I don't know if it's going to be enough to win the playoff NFC this year, but my fingers are crossed.
I hope so for him. And fantasy-wise, I hope that offense continues to hum as good as it has been in years past, especially even better with Dirk Koetter. So, Jeanna, thanks so much for taking the time, joining us, and giving us a little more insight into all these fantastic weapons they've got there. Appreciate the time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
All righty.